As Japanese Zeros picked off American torpedo bombers swarming around the aircraft carriers one by one, it seemed that nothing could stop the mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, who had been sweeping across the Pacific unchecked for the previous 6 months since Pearl Harbor. But in the darkest hour of the war in the Pacific for the United States, the next few minutes would completely change the course of history. In one of the most dramatic battles of World War II, a handful of U.S. Navy pilots would secure a victory and change the war's momentum. This is the story of the Battle of Midway. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japan believed its advantage over the Americans had grown even greater after sinking 2 of their carriers. The tactical victory boosted Japanese confidence and reinforced the belief that the Americans lacked the strength or will to strike back. It seemed the perfect moment to deliver a final blow and destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan had begun preparing for a decisive encounter even before the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Doolittle raid and the bombing of Tokyo reinforced their belief that the threat from American carriers had to be eliminated and that their defensive perimeter needed to be pushed further east. For that reason, the Imperial Japanese Navy decided to seize Midway Atoll, located halfway between Asia and North America. By doing so, they aimed not only to capture a key outpost in the Central Pacific, but also to lure the American fleet into battle. On May 1, 1942, Japanese admirals gathered around the giant battleship Yamato to conduct war games for Operation Mai, the planned attack on Midway. These exercises were intended to test the strength of the plan, which most Japanese officers treated as flawless. The games revealed several weaknesses, some of them quite serious. When a Japanese officer acting as the American Red Force repositioned U.S. carriers in the early stage of the battle to flank the Japanese fleet, the move was dismissed as unrealistic. Later, when that same officer launched a successful strike that sank 2 Japanese carriers, the arbiter again intervened. He ruled the damage excessive and reduced the outcome. It was a serious mistake the Japanese were making. No one considered the possibility that the Americans might strike first. Only Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, raised a concern. He asked what would happen if the U.S. carriers appeared at the wrong time. Chief Strategist Minoru simply replied that 1 strike would be enough to win. Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States himself and understood the American fighting spirit and capabilities, decided to not factor in the possibility of American carriers being at Midway. To carry out the plan, Admiral Yamamoto relied on Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier strike force comprising 6 large carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shukaku, and Zuikaku, supported by a number of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Together, the carriers would launch over 400 aircraft in a single wave, which was far more than what American carriers could do at the time. The Japanese also had superior aircraft in their fleet. The Zero fighter was able to outmaneuver most American planes at this stage of the war. The Japanese pilots were better trained and more experienced. They were chosen through a tough training process with high dropout rates. The Kido Butai was under the command of Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, a cautious leader who often disagreed with Yamamoto. Although Nagumo had led the Pearl Harbor attack, many questioned whether he was steady enough to command such a formidable force. On December 7, 1941, the Kido Butai inflicted serious damage on the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor, but missed critical targets like the American carriers and fuel depots. Still, Yamamoto and the Imperial Japanese Navy believed the sheer size of their force at Midway would guarantee victory. As support to Nagumo's force, Yamamoto positioned his main fleet including battleships and additional carriers several hundred miles to the west. Yamamoto expected that the Kido Butai's attack on Midway would force the U.S. Navy to dispatch its remaining carriers to defend the atoll. At that point, he would bring in his main force and crush the American fleet in open waters. Simultaneously with the attack on Midway, Yamamoto planned a diversionary operation in the Aleutian Islands called Operation All. The goal was to seize the remote islands of Attu and Kiska and divert American attention from the Central Pacific. The Japanese invasion force successfully occupied the islands, which would become the only U.S. territory taken by enemy forces during World War II. However, the operation failed to distract the Americans from the main threat at Midway. Just like in the Battle of the Coral Sea, U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester Nimitz had an ace up his sleeve. And once again, it was the codebreakers who gave it to him. In early 1942, a top-secret U.S. Navy Signals Intelligence Unit based at Pearl Harbor, known as Station Hypo, began detecting an unusual pattern in Japanese radio traffic. Having already broken parts of JN-25, Japan's primary naval code, the team noticed repeated references to a target labeled AF. The intercepted messages included orders directed to carriers, transports, and other warships, suggesting preparations for a major operation involving AF. Station Commander Joseph Rochefort, who had already seen similar coded location markers like MO for Port Moresby, so he believed AF must also stand for a specific place. He suspected that AF was Midway, but officials in Washington disagreed. To prove it, Rochefort approved a deception plan proposed by Lieutenant Jasper Holmes. Midway was instructed via underwater cable to transmit an uncoded message reporting a failure in its water distillation system. Soon after, Hypo intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was experiencing a water shortage. That confirmed Rochefort's theory. AF was Midway. Now that he was certain the Japanese were aiming at Midway, Rochefort began studying the pattern of movements. Although most of the message content remained unreadable, Hypo could tell that a large operation was underway. Rochefort passed his findings to Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton, who briefed Admiral Nimitz every morning. By May, the team had gathered enough information to estimate the timing of the attack. Japanese forces were expected to strike Midway in early June. A specific message dated May 20th was said to contain the entire Japanese plan, order of battle, timing, routes, and objectives. Rochefort later claimed he delivered it to Nimitz on May 25th. At least 6 men said they saw the message, but no copy has ever been found. Nevertheless, Nimitz had enough information to know the major battle was about to take place, and he fully believed this information. Quietly, he moved his fleet into a concealed position northeast of Midway. Nimitz centered his forces around 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. These carriers formed the core of 2 task forces, Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Enterprise and Hornet, both based at Pearl Harbor, carried full air groups, while Yorktown patched up an air group made of survivors from its own squadrons and others from Saratoga. Each carrier had about 75 planes, including dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. Support ships included cruisers and a screen of destroyers with the task of guarding the carriers from surface and submarine threats. At Midway Island itself, Marine and Army air units operated from Eastern and Sand Islands. The base had around 120 planes, including Marine F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntlesses, and Army B-17s and B-26s, aircraft that were either outdated or lightly armed. The Americans were clearly outnumbered, but Admiral Nimitz remained undeterred. He waited patiently, knowing the enemy was approaching, completely unaware of the trap ahead. To ensure the fleet remained hidden, Nimitz anticipated and blocked every move Yamamoto might make. He knew the Japanese commander was cautious and would likely scan the waters before advancing toward Midway. Indeed, Yamamoto had devised Operation K to scout Pearl Harbor before attacking Midway. He wanted to use 2 long-range Kawanishi seaplanes to fly over Pearl and check if the U.S. carriers were still there. Since the planes couldn't fly far without help, Japanese submarines were sent to refuel them at a remote atoll called French Frigate Shoals. However, in late May, American vessels and planes occupied the waters around the atoll, preventing the Japanese submarines from establishing a station. Yamamoto had no option but to cancel the operation on May 31st. With no way to confirm carrier locations, he assumed the U.S. carriers were still at Pearl Harbor. Blinded by the overconfidence and fog of war, the Japanese fleet sailed into battle. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu launched a strike against Midway with a force that included 108 planes, 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, carrying 800-kilogram bombs instead of torpedoes, and 36 Zero fighters. On Midway, radar picked up the incoming force 90 miles out. U.S. commanders on the atoll scrambled all available fighters to intercept and ordered bombers to launch a counterattack toward the Japanese fleet. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-221, flying mostly outdated Brewster Buffaloes and a few Wildcats, took off to meet the attackers. The Marines had a brief moment of advantage when they dove on the Japanese formation from above. However, once the escorting Zeros reacted, the American pilots were overwhelmed. The Zeros easily outperformed the slower American fighters. 14 of the 25 Marine pilots were killed and 4 more were wounded. Despite the defenders' efforts, the Japanese bombers reached Midway and began their assault. They dropped over 38 tons of bombs on Eastern Island and Sand Island. The strikes destroyed the power plant, command post, mess hall, post office, and water lines. The aircraft servicing area and seaplane hangar were wrecked, and the oil tanks were set ablaze. The scene made it appear that Midway had been heavily damaged. However, the strike leader, Lieutenant Tominaga, assessed the situation and radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. There is a need for a second attack. Although the raid inflicted serious damage, key installations remained operational. The main aviation fuel supply had not been hit. The runways were only superficially damaged and stayed usable. Only 11 Americans were killed and 18 were wounded. Most of Midway's aircraft had already taken off before the bombs hit. The island remained a threat to the Japanese fleet. Little did Tominaga know how important his message would be to the outcome of the battle. The first American planes to launch a counterattack from Midway were 15 U.S. Army B-17 Flying Fortresses. Their original target was Admiral Tanaka's transport group, which was approaching the island in preparation for the planned invasion. However, once scouts reported the position of the Japanese carriers, the B-17s were redirected. Instead of bombing the transports, they now set their sights on the Kido Butai. The bombers reached the Japanese fleet between 8 and 8:30 a.m. Flying in stick formation, the B-17s dropped their bombs on the Japanese carriers below. But the carriers immediately began evasive maneuvers, and all of the bombs missed their targets. Admiral Nagumo made a calculated decision not to send his fighters after the high-flying B-17s. Knowing they were unlikely to hit anything and posed little threat, he chose instead to conserve his fighters for the more dangerous, low-flying Marine dive bombers that he expected would follow. Lieutenant Tominaga's call for a second strike on Midway placed Admiral Nagumo in a serious dilemma. He had held back half his planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American carriers approached. But so far, no enemy ships had been sighted. He now faced a difficult choice: keep the reserve planes for naval targets or rearm them for another attack on the island, just in case Nagumo decided to pause his rearming process and wait. Meanwhile, his fleet came under steady attack from Midway-based aircraft. This wave included Grumman TBF Avengers, SB-2U Vindicators, Douglas SBD Dauntlesses, and B-26 Marauders. To defend the fleet, nearly all available Zeros were launched. With the flight decks now needed for fighter ops, the already slow ordnance changeover was further delayed. The Japanese managed to repel the attackers, losing only 3 Zeros while downing 17 American planes. But Nagumo had little reason to celebrate. Worse still, the returning Midway strike group and Zeros were low on fuel and approaching the fleet. He couldn't launch and recover aircraft at the same time, and the hangar decks were still cluttered with partially rearmed bombers, making a hasty launch impossible. At 8:35, Nagumo made his final decision: recover the returning aircraft first, then prepare and launch a full strike. It was a fatal mistake, as the American strike force was just minutes away. As soon as they received news of the Japanese attack on Midway, the carriers Hornet and Enterprise launched their aircraft against the Kido Butai. However, the American level of organization was far below that of the Japanese. While Nagumo had launched 108 planes in just 7 minutes, Admiral Spruance's crews took an entire hour to do the same job. Many planes burned fuel circling while waiting for the last aircraft to launch. To make matters worse in this critical race against time, the strike force from Hornet took a course to the west versus the contact report of southwest. This heading took them far north of the enemy's position. Commander John C. Waldron disagreed with Air Commander Stanhope Ring's judgment and eventually ordered his torpedo squadron to break off from the dive bombers and take their heading to the southwest. An hour and a half after the first launch, Waldron's calculations were right. The torpedo squadron had found the enemy. However, the squadron of 15 Devastators flew low and slow, allowing the Japanese fighters to spot them on time and take off to meet them. One by one, the Zeros shot down each of the slow-moving planes. Next came Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise. They too were cut down by veteran Japanese pilots in Agile Zeros. Last came Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown. Unlike previous squadrons, these 12 Devastators had 6 Wildcat fighters for cover. It allowed a few of them to break through and release their torpedoes. However, not a single torpedo struck a Japanese ship. As it turned out, the standard U.S. Navy's aerial torpedo, Mark 13, had serious drawbacks. First, when dropped from heights of over 50 feet or speeds above 110 knots, it suffered structural damage, which was quite peculiar for a torpedo designed for aircraft deployment. Also, the torpedoes frequently ran deeper than set, causing them to miss targets by passing underneath. Even the contact exploder, responsible for detonation upon impact, was unreliable. Sometimes even direct hits failed to trigger explosions. Curiously, no one in the Navy found it necessary to question the torpedo even after the fiasco at Midway. The attack of 2 large American strike forces ended in complete failure. Not a single Japanese vessel was damaged, not even a scratch. It seemed as though the Americans could do nothing to even disturb the Japanese. But that was only how it seemed. Although the torpedo bombers scored no direct hits, their attack was not in vain. The Zeros that had taken off to intercept them were pulled down to sea level. More importantly, they burned through their fuel and had to return to their carriers. Inside those carriers, bombers were still being rearmed and could not take off. There was no one to defend the skies over Kido Butai, and it was right when the 3rd American Strike Force appeared, the dive bombers. 32 dive bombers from Enterprise under the leadership of Air Group Commander C. Wade McCluskey Jr. had been flying over open ocean for more than an hour. Running low on fuel, they were about to return when they spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi racing north at top speed. It had been left behind after spending 2 hours hunting the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey's decision to follow it was a brilliant move. 10 minutes later, Arashi led him straight to the Japanese carrier fleet. All 4 carriers were there: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. During the previous attack, the Japanese formation had fallen apart. Each carrier had maneuvered independently to dodge American torpedoes. Now the carriers were scattered. They were zigzagging and signaling with lights and flags, but most importantly, none of them had spotted the incoming American planes. McCluskey ordered the lead squadron, Scouting 6 under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, to attack the carrier on the left, Kaga. Bombing 6 under Lieutenant Commander Dick Best was supposed to hit the right side carrier Akagi, but due to confusion and lack of radio contact, both squadrons began diving on Kaga. 27 dive bombers plunged down toward the huge carrier. Japanese lookouts noticed them only seconds before the attack began. The Zeros were still low, chasing American torpedo planes. Anti-aircraft guns on Kaga were aimed too low. The carrier's captain, Okada Jisaku, tried to turn the carrier, but the giant ship was too slow. The first few bombs missed. Then Gallagher hit Kaga with a 500-pound bomb that exploded below the flight deck. Another bomb struck near the elevators, while others hit the hangar decks packed with armed and fueled planes. One bomb smashed into the bridge, killing Captain Okada and most of his senior officers. 10 bombers from Best's squadron added 1,000-pound bombs to the attack. Within a minute, the entire ship erupted into a series of secondary explosions. Flames and smoke engulfed Kaga from stem to stern. It was finished. Best, now with 2 wingmen, turned toward Akagi. They climbed back to attack altitude and started a slow dive from 14,000 feet. As they approached, there was no gunfire. The Zeros were still down low. Best dropped his bomb from 1,500 feet. It hit directly on the flight deck near the island, punching through and exploding on the hangar deck. The explosion ignited the fueled aircraft and bombs and torpedoes that were scattered all over the place. Best's single hit was enough. At Kaga, Akagi was soon burning out of control. Her rudder got jammed and she began spinning in tight circles. At the same time, a separate group of 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arrived over the northern part of the Japanese formation. Their target was Soryu. At least 3 bombs struck Soryu, one forward near the elevator, one in the engine space, and one midships. Each blast ignited aviation fuel and ordnance. Flames tore through the ship. Japanese sailors on nearby ships said they could see right through her. Soryu was broken and burning from end to end. All 3 carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were crippled within 5 minutes. Admiral Nagumo was in shock. The Japanese had just tasted some of their own medicine. The elite carrier fleet was crippled in a quick and decisive blow, the samurai style. With their sole remaining carrier, Hiryu, the Japanese made an attempt to strike back. At 11 a.m., they launched 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. American radar spotted them 46 miles out. All available fighters and bombers in the area responded. U.S. Wildcats shot down 11 Vals before they reached the ship. However, 7 survived and made it through heavy anti-aircraft fire. 3 bombs hit Yorktown and damaged its flight decks and 5 of its boilers. It caused the ship to lose power and remain dead in the water. But Yorktown was a tough nut to crack. Its crew quickly contained the fires, patched the flight deck, restored steam to 3 boilers, and got the ship moving again. Just then, a second wave from Hiryu appeared. 10 Kate torpedo bombers with 6 Zeros. Yorktown was hit again. 2 torpedoes that struck the ship's port side, increasing the flooding and caused a heavy list. Without power, the pumps didn't work. Damage control could do nothing to stop the flooding. Fearing the ship would roll over, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the commanding officer of the USS Yorktown, gave the order to abandon ship at 2:55. Over 2,200 crewmen were evacuated by nearby destroyers. Captain Buckmaster was the last to leave, checking every deck. Yorktown, the carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and refused to go down, now lay crippled. This time, it was doomed. The battle was not over, though, as the Americans had more to offer. At 3:25 p.m., Enterprise launched a new attack with 24 dive bombers in 3 squadrons. Earl Gallagher led 6 planes from Scouting 6. Dick Best led 4 from Bombing 6. Dave Shumway led 14 planes from Yorktown's Bombing 3. The original plan was for the 10 Enterprise planes to hit the carrier and the Yorktown planes to attack battleships. The American planes spotted Hiryu just before 5 p.m. Gallagher climbed to 19,000 feet to attack from the west out of the setting sun. The Japanese had only a few Zeros on patrol and didn't spot the attack until it was too late. Gallagher dove first, but his bomb missed, as did the bombs from both of his wingmen. Shumway then shifted his Yorktown group to attack the carrier instead of the escorts. He attacked simultaneously with Dick Best's group. Zeros rushed to meet them, but there was no way they were stopping 18 planes. The first bomb hit the forward elevator. It was followed by 3 more bombs hitting the forward flight deck, creating a giant crater. Flames shot from the bow. Unlike the other Japanese carriers, Hiryu had less ordnance on board, so secondary explosions were fewer. But the direct hits were enough. The carrier was wrecked. Its flight deck destroyed and could no longer launch or recover planes. The last threat from the Japanese carriers had been eliminated. And so the battle ended. Admiral Yamamoto suffered a devastating blow, but he still hoped for a final victory. He ordered surface ships to search for the U.S. carriers and even directed cruisers to shell Midway. Nagumo, the admiral of the disaster at Midway, was replaced by Admiral Kondo. But once again, Nimitz was one step ahead. Anticipating that Yamamoto might commit surface forces, he ordered the American carriers to withdraw. When Yamamoto failed to locate the U.S. fleet, he finally accepted defeat. On the morning of June 5th, he ordered a general retreat, but the message reached his cruisers too late. They were only 90 miles from Midway. When the order finally reached them after midnight on June 5th, Japanese cruisers Mogami, Mikuma, Suzuya, and Kumano turned north. In the dark, a lookout from Kumano spotted an unidentified vessel. It was the U.S. submarine Tambor. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the group, ordered an emergency turn. As the vessels turned sharply, Mogami crashed into Mikuma's armor belt. Mikuma had minor damage, but Mogami's bow was crushed. With Mogami damaged, Mikuma had to slow down to keep pace. By the dawn of June 6th, the 2 cruisers had not yet left the range of U.S. patrol planes from Midway. Around 9:30 a.m., American dive bombers from Hornet found the 2 cruisers. During the attack, Mogami suffered 2 hits and one of its destroyers was also damaged. At noon, a second wave from Enterprise attacked. This time, they scored 5 direct hits on Mikuma. One bomb went down the smokestack and exploded inside. The cruiser stopped and began to burn heavily. By the time the third wave from Hornet arrived at 2:30 p.m., Mikuma was dead in the water, still on fire. Hundreds of Japanese sailors were floating in the water around it. Spruance had decided not to send more attacks. Fuel was low and Japanese planes from Wake Island were a threat. That evening, the American task force turned back east. Mikuma was left burning and sank soon after. Mogami, though badly damaged, managed to escape. The Battle of Midway was finally over, yet the USS Yorktown was still fighting for its life. After being abandoned on June 4th, the destroyer Hughes was ordered to stay nearby Yorktown and sink the carrier if the enemy approached. But Yorktown stayed afloat. On June 5th, the minesweeper Viriel arrived and began slowly towing her east. There was a hope that another repair might save this magnificent ship. Captain Buckmaster decided to send a volunteer salvage crew back aboard. 29 officers and 141 sailors transferred from nearby ships. Using power and steam from the destroyer Haman tied alongside, they put out fires and started correcting the list. By noon on June 6th, the Yorktown began to stabilize. Then, at 1:30 p.m., lookouts spotted white torpedo wicks. Japanese submariner I-168 slipped through the destroyer's scene and fired 4 torpedoes from just 1,200 yards. One hit Yorktown near the bow. Another struck her further aft. A third hit Haman, which was tied alongside. The destroyer broke in half and began to sink. Its depth charges exploded underwater, badly damaging Yorktown's hull. For a second time, Buckmaster ordered to abandon ship. Though Yorktown remained afloat for hours, she was slowly sinking. At 4:58 a.m. on June 7th, she finally went under. Captain Buckmaster, watching from a destroyer, saluted the carrier as it disappeared beneath the sea. The loss of Yorktown was a fair price for the victory achieved. However, the American victory was not clear at first. Even President Roosevelt called the battle indecisive in a message to Stalin. It wasn't until June 19th that U.S. commanders confirmed that all 4 enemy carriers had been destroyed. Japan's main carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, was gone. Their only gain was the remote Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, which proved worthless. After Midway, Japan lost their initiative. Their strategy shifted to defense, hoping to exhaust the U.S. into a settlement. But the opposite happened. American morale surged, and the push for an offensive in the Pacific began. By the end of the war, Japan had never recovered from the losses in aircraft, pilots, and carriers. In contrast, American strength only grew. New Essex-class carriers joined the fleet. Pilots trained in vast programs replaced every loss. By late 1943, 7 new carriers carried over 1,000 fresh aircraft into battle. The Battle of Midway had changed everything, and the Americans deserved the spoils. They won it through a combination of intelligence, leadership, timing, and courage. The success of the American codebreakers who uncovered Japan's attack plan allowed Admiral Nimitz to set a trap near Midway. In this, timing was critical. Dive bombers from Enterprise arrived just as Japanese decks were filled with bombs and fuel, making them vulnerable. Admiral Spruance made bold choices under pressure, launching strikes without waiting for ideal conditions. His calm decision-making helped catch the enemy off guard. American pilots, who were considered inferior to their Japanese adversaries, showed that they were up to the task. It was their courage that made the difference in the air. Their teamwork, skill, and willingness to press the attack despite overwhelming odds turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the Militology Channel. Stay tuned.